Good morning. Hello, everyone. This is Will Gasper, Hospice in Michigan, grief support counselor coming from Cadillac to you, wherever you are. And I just want to welcome you on the behalf of myself and Wes Lawton down in West Bloomfield. As we continue this Men Overcoming Loss, we're posting it on YouTube shortly after, within a few days, hopefully, of our grief support online program, Men Overcoming Loss, on this third Tuesday of every month. And that's at 6 p.m. And Wes and I are very, very excited about this venture that Hospice of Michigan has blessed us with the opportunity to do. And so I just want to start out by saying that this is not a therapeutic session. This is a educational session. And we want you to just gather information. And perhaps if you need to consult with a counselor one-on-one, please Google Psychology Today, and they will have a list of counselors in your area in the state of Michigan that will be able to help you personally. Or you can reach out to Hospice of Michigan, Will Gasper, or Wes Lawton, and we would be happy to work with you on the phone, possibly if you were in West Bloomfield, Cadillac, Big Rapids, even Grand Rapids, we can arrange some one-on-one meetings if that's what's needed. So today's topic is about the instrumental grieving versus intuitive grieving. And let me pull up my screen here to show you kind of the continuum and some of the things that are under each category there. So as we talk about instrumental versus intuitive grieving, I want to share this screen with you, and then we'll kind of proceed from there. So as we can see, the instrumental versus intuitive grieving styles are both ends of the spectrum. And Martin and Doka came up with this concept almost 20 years ago now. And actually, we have looked at this as a kind of a sliding scale where very few people are at the instrumental on the left, on my left anyway, and then majority of women are probably not at the total intuitive grieving style. So it doesn't mean that you have to operate or you are operating in either or. It's kind of a continuum where you can be flexible in your grieving style, and we're going to explain how that works here. So by instrumental, when we talk about instrumental grieving, it is a way of grieving that talks about or channels energy into activity. So some men tend to ignore or put aside, rather, their thoughts and their feelings and their emotions, but takes that energy that they have in their grieving process and put it into activity. And activity can range from many different things, and that includes working probably to access kind of the workaholic approach to avoiding dealing with their grief, avoiding dealing with their emotions, their feelings. And so there's a story about a gentleman who lost his son about 5 years ago up in the Traverse City area. And his son was about to graduate from high school. And it was in a tragic car accident. And so this father was approached by the son's girlfriend shortly after the funeral. And she told him that his son really wanted to have a hunting cabin at the back of their property. So this gentleman considered it and then started drawing up plans and making that happen. So over the course of that summer, he put all his energy, his grief energy and grieving energy into building a 16 by 24 foot cabin at the back of their property. And over the course of the summer, enlisted help from the other male family members. And together, they built this wonderful tribute to the son he had lost. And that cabin became a place of solace and a place to honor the son that he had lost. They paneled it in knotty pine paneling. They put pictures. They put deer antler mounts, fish mounts, and things that belonged to his son in that cabin. And so that opening day, of course, in Michigan, is November 15th, a group of men gathered, men from the family, gathered in that cabin to experience and to celebrate the memories of the young man that had passed away. So those sort of things, other men have put their energy into possibly a cause, could be going out and speaking to high school groups, could go toward, their energy could go toward perhaps raising money for a certain cause that their loved one was championing. And so that they feel that they're making a difference somehow. Instrumental men often would like to discuss problems rather than feelings. And this is what separates intuitive grievers from instrumental grievers, because instrumental grievers are focusing on what the solutions of these problems are. And us men are usually labeled as fixers, problem solvers. So we want to identify the problem and then come up with solutions to those problems, rather than dealing with the feelings that we may be feeling at the time. We focus on cognition rather than affect. And again, that is kind of a fancy terms for thinking about the situation rather than focusing on how we're feeling or those emotions that kind of are laying underneath our grief. We desire to master our feelings. Try to gain a hold of those feelings and identifying, how we can overcome those feelings rather than talking about those feelings. And that last bullet point on this slide talks about immersing self in problem solving. And that goes back to the first bullet point, again, looking at taking our energy and putting that into how do we fix this problem? How do we get past those feelings of of helplessness and grief and sadness. All those other feelings are kind of put aside in order to work on solving the problems. However, discussing feelings openly is very difficult for most men. Now, some men, around a cup of coffee, around some other activity, may feel permission in a safe environment to talk about some of their feelings. But most men in the instrumental grieving style really struggle with discussing these feelings openly, because society expects most of us men to kind of just stuff it down, suck it up, buttercup type of approach. Be a big man. Big men don't cry. And so they find it very difficult to be vulnerable enough to talk openly about their feelings and their emotions. Most have learned at an early age that showing emotions is not acceptable. And again, most of those feelings, most of those learned behaviors come from our dads, our uncles, our grandparents. And that is, again, back to something society has probably taught us at an early age, that even if we're feeling pain, physical pain, we just kind of just suck it up and we go on, wash it off, throw a Band-Aid on it, and continue on with life. And that's not always workable as men become a little bit more vulnerable in safe environments. And probably that is a good thing, that men are kind of acquiescing and realizing that identifying those emotions and actually talking about those emotions is acceptable in some situations, especially safe situations such as a pastor, such as a trusted friend who perhaps has had a loss of their own. Men in the instrumental grieving process, or the instrumental part of grieving styles, usually mourn in solitude, going along thinking that nobody else would understand. Nobody else really knows what I'm going through. So often men in the instrumental grieving style prefer to mourn in solitude, prefer to kind of close the blinds, if you will, and not let anybody in to what's going on inside of them. And that can be detrimental to actually going through the grieving process, because as the old saying, myth is, that time heals all wounds. And I'm not convinced that that is true, because after 20 years, if you do not mourn, if you do not grieve properly and work through the grieving process, and 20 years isn't going to solve the loss that you may feel if you're totally in the instrumental mode. And just to clarify, grieving and mourning are two different things. Sure, they're related, but grieving is the internal emotions, those emotions and feelings that one may be experiencing underneath the surface. But what mourning is the external expression of crying, of showing sadness, showing vulnerability, those sort of things, and expressing those feelings and those emotions. Instrumental men are more likely to exhibit addictive behaviors. whether that's alcohol, drugs, gambling, anything that may kind of push back the pain, anything that might push back and self-medicate the emotions. And like I mentioned earlier, workaholism could be a very addictive behavior that's totally unhealthy because it just kind of kicks the can down the road and doesn't deal with the issues that are just underneath the surface. So using the next bullet point here, using activity to channel excess energy or memorializing the deceased is a very well-used behavior that kind of negates or avoids dealing with the emotion. Taking that activity, just like I talked about that man in Traverse City, using that pent-up energy in his emotions and his grief to build that cabin for his son, memorializing his son through the building of that cabin, using that shared experience with other men, again, avoids dealing with the internalized emotions and feelings. As intuitive as opposed to instrumental, again, not all women are on the intuitive, the exact end of the spectrum, the total intuitive area of grief. But let's start with those bullet points here, and with the words that my colleague Wes Lawton talked about on our last presentation online back in January, talked about that most women tend to be a little bit more toward the middle of the spectrum, but there are women that, and there are some men, don't get me wrong, this is not totally a men versus women's issue, because some men, if depending on their experience, depending on their family of origin, their experiences, can also be intuitive grievers. So the first bullet point talks about the intensity of affect over cognition. And by that we mean the feelings of emotions and the recognition of the feelings are the predominant underlying issues that will come to the surface a lot sooner for intuitive grievers, rather than thinking about how to talk about problems and thinking about their emotions. They're actually acknowledging and expressing their emotions, which leads us to the second bullet point. A grief expressed is a grief experienced. And often women, especially in our grief support groups that we have here at Hospice in Michigan, and possibly other grief support groups that are going on in our state, face-to-face anyway. Online could be a little bit different, because I think men appreciate that little bit of a separation, kind of a veil, if you will, to personal contact. But in face-to-face group sessions, in my experience, that women will often, if they're intuitive grievers, openly talk about their grief, talk about their emotions, and in talking about that, they are releasing some of that pent-up emotions, those pent-up feelings, and sharing that with others. So that this statement, a grief expressed is a grief experienced. And sharing that experience with others seems to be very therapeutic. And it's not always counselor or therapeutic based. It's just a social based experience, I believe, that happens when intuitive grievers are sharing that grief experience. Intuitive grievers center activities on the experience of grief itself. We have found also that having rituals, having memorial type of activities that honor our loved ones is a very therapeutic, very honored, very treasured experience for those in the intuitive grieving style, because those emotions are expressed in actions or expressed in some sort of ritualistic way that will help the emotion be named and experienced. So those type of things like Hospice of Michigan does Fly and Remember, which is something that Hospice of Michigan offers across the state in our 7 or 8 offices for not only our Hospice of Michigan families, but for the communities that we exist in, for those bereaved to come to a certain venue and decorate these very simple kites in honor of their loved ones. And often those folks, and there are some men that attend that event, but mostly it's women, as they are decorating their kites, honoring their loved ones, putting their loved one's name on these kites, and using colored markers to decorate these kites, and then seeing these kites flown up in the air by volunteers, by sometimes school children will be involved in helping our older women, older folks that are grieving, to actually launch those kites and to see them fly. And so to see them expressing their grief using their creative sides, their physical working with their hands, it seems to really be very therapeutic in working through their grief. Adapting to the loss with their feelings. The next bullet point talks about actually learning how to kind of walk through those feelings by recognizing that life is not going to be the same. Life is going to be a new adaptation to the normal life that they are experiencing without their loved one physically present. And so that has been a process that I've seen, and that process may take 2 or 3 years. And that's okay, because the first year is almost a blur to most folks that have experienced a loss, because those first year anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, those first year memories are traumatic, and often most folks are ill prepared to deal with those type of special days. So learning how to adapt and to plan for those special days is another way or another challenge to adapting to the loss. But we urge folks that are intuitive grievers to talk about possibly their plans, or to give them permission to say no to invitations for those certain days. And it could be Christmas, Thanksgiving, anniversaries, wedding anniversaries, could be the anniversary of the death, could be birthdays, could be 4th of July. Anything that was special to the bereaved as well as to the person that they lost. Intuitive grievers are less likely to seek out problems that need to be solved. They're most likely to talk about, again, back to their feelings, back to their emotions, and back to their experiences of what has happened and what it's been like, rather than seeking out problems that need to be solved. Because again, most intuitive grievers are women, but not all. And so most women seem to relish talking and trying to find out these feelings of grief that lie just underneath the surface. Intuitive grievers need to openly discuss feelings with others. And back to the reference or my story about grief support groups. That's why grief support groups, face-to-face, in fact, even more increasingly, the online grief support, Compassionate Friends is one of them that comes to mind that is available online, gives people an opportunity to openly discuss their experiences as well as their feelings with others. And it's very therapeutic, even with a counselor present, to hear folks talking among themselves about their emotions and their feelings that they've experienced at times during their journey. And it's not just that first year, like I previously mentioned a few minutes ago. It could be a year or 2 years down the road, because they want to talk about maybe it was a little bit better. Maybe they were a little bit more prepared to deal with those special days, those special emotions that were tied to these special days that they have had with their loved ones, as they remember celebrating with their loved ones. Intuitive grievers learned at a very early age through watching their parents, watching folks around them, their aunts, uncles, grandparents, possibly their church community, that at an early age, it was okay at a funeral, at a gathering, that it was okay to break down a little bit, to have a good cry, to just be sad and tearful. And that's okay, because they were given permission to do that. Whereas as we talked about earlier, instrumental grievers were not giving that permission at an early age to show those emotions. It wasn't appropriate. Intuitive grievers mourn in community. That's why community-wide memorials are often attended by mostly women, but not all. Some men do show up to observations, memorials, such as Fly and Remember, or some other things that are offered in the community. Often our Hospice of Michigan offices, through their grief counselors in each office, will offer a holiday hope for the holidays celebration or memorial around Thanksgiving through the Christmas season, to commemorate those memories of our loved ones. And often those are attended by mostly women, But again, some men choose to give themselves permission to come also to those type of memorial celebrations. Intuitive grievers seek support of others rather than turning to addictive behaviors. So they will seek advice, seek support, seek understanding of trusted friends, perhaps pastors, or other ministries in a church community that will offer support, grief support, just a listening, someone that will absolutely just sit down and listen, rather than turning to addictive behaviors to handle their grief. They will often avoid alcohol and drug abuse and gambling and these other addictive behaviors that postpone the grief, that delay the grief, that avoid the grief. So they're seeking ways and to express in a safe environment their feelings and feeling supported by others in their community. So when we talk about the difference, we can see that the spectrum is on a continuum, and it's very important to recognize that it doesn't have to be totally intuitive, and it doesn't have to be totally instrumental. There's room for grieving on the full spectrum. And after the meeting, or as the meeting drew to a close 2 weeks ago, we had men share this fact that there seems to be a shifting in society where men are giving permission, have been given permission to actually express their emotions. So there's a shifting in society that's been happening, and we believe through grief counseling experiences that men in society are now coming to a kind of happy medium where it's okay to actually express and show some vulnerability and some need to talk about their grief, especially for men, to talk about grief in public, in a safe public environment. And so we see that as a very, very helpful shift, and we're happy, and we'll celebrate that and promote that as much as we can. Another gentleman shared how helpful it was to use a journal, especially early on, using blank pages in a journal type of format, writing down the date, writing down feelings, writing down emotions, writing down thoughts. And even if it's one word, even if it's one sentence, could be a paragraph, could be a whole page, but recording some of those experiences, and then the next day, the next week, coming back and putting down some more feelings, more emotions, more thoughts, and then continuing that journal for however long the person would like to do that. Because looking back, as they say, grief is best experienced looking back. Grief progress, that is, looking backwards. So several months down the road, it can be powerful, very therapeutic to look back at that journal entry and look at where you were as opposed to where you are now. The gentleman that said that has been grieving for 22 years. And when I say grieving, I wouldn't say that in a mournful way. He memorializes the memory of his wife that he lost 22 years ago. And he wrote a book about his experiences and about his thoughts. And so I would encourage any of you to seek out resources that will help you understand some other men's journeys. And there are a bunch of resources out there for men. And as we continue to go through this series, we will have a list of those resources for all of you to have a look at and perhaps pursue. Another gentleman, before we closed last time, talked about Facebook and the social media support that he has experienced regarding the loss of his wife. And he feels that the group that has been supportive of his grief and supportive of the memory of his wife has given him strength to face each and every day. And I see that. I think I would speak for my colleague, Wes Lawton, down in West Bloomfield when I say this, that can be very, very supportive in our grief process as well as any other thing that we can do, because social media now is everywhere. Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, of course. All those mediums can be helpful and can be supportive. And we encourage folks that notice and are willing to and wanting to support anyone of their friends, anyone in the community that is grieving, to reach out, if no other way, to reach out in a Facebook post. Could be public, could be private message, to support those folks that they're concerned about. And we just are very, very supportive of all of you gentlemen. Perhaps there's some ladies also listening, watching this YouTube video that this video may have helped understand a little bit about the differences between men and women in intuitive versus instrumental grieving. And so we invite all of you to come back to this Hospice of Michigan presentation, February 18th at 6 p.m. And that's a Tuesday, the third Tuesday of this month. So for Wes Lawton, Will Gasper, myself, and Hospice of Michigan, we thank you for tuning in. We thank you for reaching out to help yourself. Because as we know that the grief process is not a linear process whatsoever. It's often a convoluted mess, much like a roller coaster ride, going through the denial, the shock, the anger, moving toward bargaining, moving toward, again, back to maybe anger, back to just depression. All of these thoughts and all of these emotions and many other ones that are just below the surface can rear their ugly heads at any time, knowing that each day a new trigger or an old trigger, such as a song or a going by a certain place, maybe a favorite restaurant, or possibly smell of perfume or cologne, can trigger a memory that will bring on sadness. And it's like the waves of the ocean. At first, they're kind of overwhelming. And as you work on your grief and you work on your progress, suddenly those waves seem to be a little bit more calmer, a little bit more gentle. And they may still take us by surprise, but perhaps they won't wipe us off of our feet. So with that closing thought, thank you very much for tuning in, and may you continue to work on your grief and in a very positive and a very therapeutic manner. Take care.